just you and Mary.
Later?
Soon.
Soon?
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think that might be
I
helpful
saw
for
a
people to
couple
be
of
able to see.
vines that look like they'll be ready, if it stays warm this week, maybe in a week, but then again, it's not supposed to be all that warm, so
Oh, you did?
Good.
Okay.
we'll see. But, I am
Good, good.
supposed to be away this coming weekend, and I'm really hoping I don't leave the boss with frost protection alone. I mean, if you have other people, but
Yeah, yeah.
I have my share of it to do too.
Are you doing something fun?
I'm going to New York to see a friend for a couple of days, so
Good for you. That's totally fun.
it certainly qualifies.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, I'm envious.
oh,
I wanted to go. I have 30th? I don't know. Some really, really big number of reunions of college. 87, so this might be 40th?
where's college?
Bryn Mawr,
Oh,
outside of
Bryn Mawr. Yeah,
Philadelphia.
yeah, of course. Sure.
Yeah. So because I haven't seen my East Coast friends. None of them followed me home, of course. So I only get to see them like every 5, 10 years.
When you go back.
Yeah. But then I bought a house, so I don't know if I'm going.
We gonna have quorum?
We are. Supposedly, yes.
Okay.
We try to make sure we have a drop dead date, like the
Sorry,
snow
I guess
day,
I
so
shouldn't
that
have
we
said
can let
that.
people
Yeah.
know.
Whoops.
Yeah, right? Thanks, Patrick.
I'm sorry.
Jennifer's usually a couple minutes late, and Nara said she'd be about 10 to 15 minutes late, so she gets late.
Okay. That's that's fine. I emailed it to Ruby, so I think it's good. I'm not logged into Zoom right now.
Okay.
Do you have
So
Patrick's presentation?
Okay, well, then, I can, I mean, I can, if you want to email it to me, or we can just put it on the screen.
I emailed Mary and Ruby
Okay.
the PDF, but I can go into
Do
Zoom
it.
otherwise.
Ruby, do you want to do it, or should Mary do it? I have no attachment.
You have no attachment. Oh. Well, let me try that again.
Are you watching the Zoom?
No, I think we can capture it. Do we have a sign-in sheet? We do. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Tom, that'd be awesome.
Oh.
Gotta figure out how to spell my name.
Yeah, right?
I know.
I struggle with it every time I write it down.
Got it.
Don't feel bad. Don't feel.
Everybody struggles with my first name.
Okay. I will
Thanks for coming.
Let me give you something.
I will forward it to
Hey, Tom. Yeah.
both of
Talk
you.
to you outside.
Yes, I did send it without the email, without the attachment, so that will make it more difficult for you. We just updated. I just updated my laptop. They did all this work on it, and so I'm not. I get errors when I switch between Zoom and Teams, so I'm a little scared until I get this fixed
Totally.
to
My laptop
do
is
that.
still old version. It hasn't converted.
Oh,
I'm afraid to
savor
use
that
it.
moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm randomly cutting out. It keeps trying to switch between um, the speaker. I don't know. I'm.
Right.
Oh, no, that was the one. There it is.
Technology making our lives easier.
Is it?
It's not that one?
Oh,
No.
it's not this
Maker,
one?
maybe.
Oh, okay, let me, is that maybe?
Let's not look at the government website.
Are you sure?
Did you know that I gave them the wrong data? I
Oh.
sat there and happily rah-rahed 2023's data, not 2024's.
Oops.
Can you put a presentation on that?
So of
Sure.
course somebody caught it in the public and pointed it out to EJ.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Do you wanna control your screen or do you want?
Um,
Oh,
it's just that one.
photo.
Yeah, yeah. That's all I'm putting up, so we're good.
Marco, was I at all helpful, your last email? Okay, good. I wasn't sure if I was just kept making it worse. Okay, good. Could we So, for those of you out in the Zoom room, we are still waiting for quorum here in the board chambers, and we'll get started probably within the next 7 or 8 minutes because we have a couple members that said they're going to be a little late. Thanks. Ready? Great. Thank you, everybody, for coming to the March 3rd Cannabis Ordinance Task Force meeting. We started a little late because we knew we were getting quorum. We just had to wait till it happened. Ruby, would you go ahead and take roll call? There you go. That looks like it worked. Why don't I just take roll call? So we have Catherine Vanderwall.
Here.
Nara Dolbaka.
Here.
Rebecca is not here today. Jennifer Smith.
Here.
Will Weiss.
Present.
And we're missing Robert Geary. Is he online? Okay. And we have a vacancy currently in South Lake County. But just for the public, we do have appointment for South Lake County representative on the March 11th board agenda. So that's coming up.
Is that the only seat we're going to fill?
We do have that seat primary vacancy. We also have all alternate positions for everything except for cannabis industry. Those are all available. When is the deadline? Let's see. Do have it ready for the agenda, but the deadline to get things uploaded is usually 15 days ahead of time. So if anybody is still interested, the application link is available on the Board of Supervisors webpage. If you scroll down to the bottom right-hand side, it's the standard boards and commissions application page. And so if you do fill that out, please make note of which position you're applying for. It's helpful for us to get it figured out so that it's on the agenda accurately. We don't have the members available to approve the minutes from December 5th. So we will move to minutes of January 27th, 2025. And I'm going to hand this over to you so I can text Supervisor Rasmussen and let him know I'll get with him soon.
So with that, did the task force want to move forward with the January 27th, 2024, or sorry, was it any questions for that item? No questions? And we can open that for public input.
Hello, task force and staff. On page 11 of the packet, on item 6 in the agenda minutes, there's a break in format. Task force minutes are usually action-oriented, and so there is no description of content from the public. I just wanted to draw that to your attention. Thank you.
Can you state your name for the record, please?
Margot Kambara.
So, Margot, you're saying you'd like us to remove the part about what Holly Harris said, because this was identification of outstanding topics. Are you saying you don't want us to identify any of the outstanding topics presented by the public?
No, it would be below that, where we have two additional members of the public talking about what they would like to be added. That's unusual. Usually in this, when members of the public speak, it's just a matter of so-and-so spoke.
Sure. I think we had it in there just because it's identification of outstanding topics. So we wouldn't usually have it in there. You're right. It's at action minutes. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any public input, any other public input in the room? Seeing none. Any public input, hands raised on Zoom, please. Excellent. Let's go ahead and ask to unmute. Go ahead, Holly. Okay. We show you unmuted on this end, Holly. Give you a second to fiddle with your mic. Trying. Okay. Holly, if you want to put your comment in the chat, we can pick it up that way. Not sure what's up with your mic. Holly, we're going to go to Andrew and then we'll come back to you if you want to check out your mic. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Andrew Dobbs Kramer. I just wanted to note on the January 27th minutes on page 2 of the minutes, page 9 of the packet, 2C there under formal withdrawal discusses site remediation being required. And I think there's been requests by a couple members of the task force to have more clarity on what site remediation means. And I think that's probably captured in staff's notes as you go to drafting. I just wanted to see if that needed to be a note added here.
Yeah, I think that's been a note in previous minutes, hasn't it? Let's keep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Let's make sure we pull that in, Ruby. Holly, are you able to speak yet? Before we go to guest? Okay, then we'll look for, Holly, we'll look for your input on chat, and we'll go to guest to guest. Angela, please state your name for the record.
Thank you, Maria. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, this is Angela Emerald. One, the chat is disabled on Zoom, and two, are you guys recording this? Because I don't see a recording on my end.
We are recording. We're also streaming onto Facebook today and YouTube. And
Okay,
Pig.
wonderful. Yeah, just so you know that the chat is disabled. When we click on it, it says disabled, so you can't use it.
Thank you. That's helpful. Because it's a webinar, we don't have chat option. Okay. Holly, I have, if we can't get your mic, send me an email, would you? Because I can get it that way. All right, so I'll keep an eye on my email. Thank you, Angela. That was helpful. Let's do that. Well, but Angela's an attendee. She's not a panelist or a host, and she could chat. I mean, she could. Okay, now I'm getting myself mixed up. Sorry. All right. I don't want to bring it back to the task force until we've had an option, or if you, a minute for Holly to send in an email. Oh, declined panelist? She probably, okay. Holly, if you wanted to accept the invitation to become panelist, then you can access the chat that way. Or email. Excellent. Okay, so we'll give you a moment. I want to make sure we have every opportunity to take public input.
Can you hear me at this moment?
Yeah,
Okay, it wasn't until you made me a panelist that you could hear me.
thank you.
Okay, so basically, yeah, my issue was somewhat the same as what Margot just spoke about. So it's section 6. And basically, since we presented a list of about 30 or 35 issues that we wanted discussed, and it was included in the packet and it was voted on, either by votes or consensus, I am suggesting that you actually copy the list into the minutes or you attach it to the minutes.
Thank you. Bringing up.
Okay, one other thing too. The sequence is also incorrect. Basically, the task force voted on the list of public items. And then after everybody else had public input, then I was allowed to explain the list of public issues, which had already been voted on. And so I would prefer that the sequence was correct in there.
I don't see any voting.
If you
You're
watch
talking
the
about
video,
item number 6? I don't see where it says any voting on item number 6 at all.
that's an omission then, because there was voting. If you go back and watch the video, you'll see that each one went through individually and there was voting and
You're right.
talk on consensus or not.
I'd like to table this because we do need to get that accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Holly. We're going to review that and bring it back at another meeting.
Thank you.
Okey dokey. Continue. Next item on our agenda then is presentation and consideration of recommendations by the Treasurer Tax Collector. Patrick, over to you.
All right, so Patrick Sullivan, Lake County Treasurer Tax Collector. Thank you for the opportunity to present on this matter today. Previously, well, let's see, I think that was about 3 or 4 months ago, we had discussions about how to address property ownership, property owner approval, whether or not the property owner needed to be on the application, and there were various alternatives explored. I understood from the task force that there was a real desire to avoid the property owner being on the permit or the permit application, other than perhaps in some sort of approval role. Our office did initially look into it. We thought perhaps there was a way we could work through that. But since then, we have continued to run into issues heavily related to liability, enforcement, and future collections that really seem to dictate that the property owner should be on the permit. Sort of our initial thought here is to do something effective, bringing into alignment with Department of Cannabis Control regulations or State Water Board regulations, to basically have our ordinance match up more with how those work, where the property owner does appear with the applicant on these, and even those with certain levels of financial interest appear as well. But just to help run through some of this, I thought it might be helpful to put up a diagram, and can you put that up? Oh, is that visible for? Okay. So part of what's happened is that because I guess the distinction between this and other types of actions we've dealt with, that this is a permit that runs with the land. And so because the permit continues on in existence, we are regularly running into issues where properties are tax defaulted, so we're looking at doing auctions. There are foreclosures where a previous property owner, a financial interest holder, is taking the land back. And so ultimately it's very confusing for us, because trying to identify not just now who is going to have an interest or stake in that permit can be difficult, but also who holds some sort of reversion or some sort of future potential interest in that permit, and how to account for that. Because right now we often don't know who these people are. A lot of times we get filings, regulatory filings in our office, bankruptcies, legal actions. It can be any number of ways that something comes to our attention. And there's a significant amount of staff time that goes in right now simply trying to figure out what's going on, what this is referencing, because we're often provided very limited information. So just using this one as an example of trying to map out who was involved when we were looking at a Titan Valley land holdings, just for clarification, we sourced this publicly, off publicly available documents, rather than using internal records, but frankly, the internal records did not shed any more light, but just so we understand how this came to be that we're posting here. Trying to understand who's involved in this operation at a Diamond J Ranch. If you see that at the top, that's the name of the site. As you go down, Titan Valley Land Holdings is the property owner, but they're a subsidiary of Terra Firma, LLC. And we had to go to another level to figure out a name of someone who's actually involved with that. When we go back up to Titan Valley, trying to understand who else is involved, if anyone, this became confusing because the Heart Consciousness Church, another entity that doesn't appear anywhere else, is the main financial backing as far as we could tell. They're the lien holder. They have a UCC financing statement that secures against all the rents, proceeds, and crops, etc. Heart Consciousness Church took out what appeared to be a cannabis cultivation discharge permit with the water board. Then we realized that may actually be for a different site. So we had to work backwards, figure out that Great Kind Farms is the cultivation discharge permit holder that's of record as being on with Titan Valley Land Holdings. As we look at Great Kind Farms going down, they ultimately made them the project applicant. To figure out who's behind it, we had to look at Valhalla Legacy Holding Corporation as the manager of Great Kind Farms to get down to the level of the people that were involved. All of this gets really confusing, especially as there's defaulted taxes and foreclosures involved. Trying to understand ultimately who is going to end up controlling the permit or who controls it right now. And without the property owner being on the permit, and especially, I mean, what we really found now is that there can ultimately be multiple major financial interest holders that aren't disclosed to us in any way, that aren't associated with the permit application, that we can't get any information on. So when we looked at the state level, it does seem that in one way or another, that property owner and financial interest holders do have to be listed with that license, and that does solve a lot of the issues that we're facing. So I think our hope is that the county could consider basically modeling the water board and DCC regulations. There would have to be some small tweaks made because these are permits rather than licenses. But generally speaking, that same type of regulation found at the state level, if it was applied here, would resolve most of the issues that our office is having. So I'm happy to take any questions or can kick it back to Director Turner. I'm not sure what the appropriate procedure is.
Let's open it up for questions from the task force.
Just to clarify, you're asking for there to be an additional entry like the state has listing financial interest holders, but would they be they would just be listed, or what would the level of responsibility be for a financial interest holder, and what kind of percentage are you thinking in terms of that person's control?
That is an interesting question to raise, partially because, I mean, financial interest holders, and in this case, it's different when it's a permit versus a license. For instance, if the lien holder were to take the property back, the permit is ultimately going to sit with them. So for us, because of our structure, that it's a permit that runs with the land, first off, with the property owner, I guess we would want it that the property owner would be liable for anything, kind of like how the water board does it, that they're equally accountable with some sort of joint and several liability in the end. Financial interest holder is more complicated because I don't know if someone simply holds certain types of financial interests that aren't secured to the land. I don't know that they would necessarily be liable in the end, but certainly if it's secured against the business itself or secured to the land, that's different. I would think they could ultimately be liable, especially, for instance, in this case, right? If no one pays their tax bill, this goes to auction, it's very possible that Heart Consciousness Church could end up being the controlling entity for the permit. In which case, I think we'd certainly want them liable.
Is Heart Consciousness Church a church? Are they a 501c3?
I believe they run Harbin Hot Springs.
Oh,
That's the entity that controls Harbin Hot Springs.
got it.
For taxation purposes, yes, they are
They
considered
are
a
they are
church.
a 501c3 as well. They're registered as a nonprofit,
Mm, okay.
which was something else that can be confusing in trying to map these.
Can you pull up the regulations from water board? Let's see if we can, let's talk about what those are. Are there any further questions while Mary's pulling that up? Does everybody know what the regulations are for water board and DCC as far as we're talking about listing and involvement of financial interests within a permittee's or within an application?
Mhm.
I don't, so, all right, so we'll have Mary pull that up, just so we're looking at that information to make sure we're all talking about the
Okay.
same thing. And once we get that, if there are no further questions, we'll go to public input at that point.
I guess I'm struggling because, sorry, Jennifer Smith. I thought so. Maybe I'm just not using it. Is that better? It brings, I'm just, so if I'm leasing the land, so basically if I'm operating the state licenses and I have an operating agreement with the landowner owns the permit, he's my landlord. In what other business do we require that the landlord be responsible for permit taxes?
One
I
thing
might not
that
be saying that clearly, but
yeah, and I think I understand, I think where you're going with this question, and part of the difficulty is that, from my perspective, to a certain extent, we have blended elements of a license and a permit together. This permit is not like other permits, right? So if you have a liquor license, you can transfer that license to different locations in a way that you're not readily able to do with a cannabis permit. So I think it's very hard, the way this is developed, to do an apples-to-apples comparison. What I would note, for instance, though, is that the property owner in that case is on the water board permit, or should be.
yeah.
So I guess the difficult part is that that property owner is already tied directly into cannabis cultivation, that they have already taken that step to declare themselves as seeking permits to cultivate cannabis. So I don't think it's necessarily inappropriate to add other people to the permit, but if anything, the starting point should be that the property owner is on this county permit as well, especially because it runs with the land. And like I'm saying in this case, in the example given, this permit could pass to the church, to Titan Valley, or Great Kind Farms, depending on how the default of the property or a sale were to transpire.
This is a common issue in cannabis businesses. Do you know how other counties are dealing with this? Have you looked into that?
So I think that raises the point that I was just discussing, is that it's difficult to compare county to county because a lot of counties have a business license, a cannabis business license, and then there may be a use permit. We don't have business licenses in Lake County at all.
And you have to
We
hold-
don't have a cannabis business tax license. So if the tax is being associated with the license, I don't know how you can compare it to us. We're a permit that's unified.
That sounds like it's over our pay grade here. Maybe something
It's
to
a pretty big question.
It is, yeah. I know I've heard from other businesses at the county who, they're in unincorporated areas, and they're saying they want to be paying taxes to the county. That they're bringing in $500,000 a year and paid $5 or something like that to the county, and the roads outside their business are falling apart. So there might be an appetite for that for other businesses as well, to actually have a business license. And then you would need to have both of those things operational, right, in order to continue operating.
To date, there has not been an appetite at the board's level of starting a business license
Mhm.
program. We don't, from what staff has said, it would take considerable additional staff resources to manage that sort of thing. So there have been a number of places in CDD where people have requested a business license because the state requires it for their
Right.
profession. And so we have to write letters just to notify the state, whichever board that is, that we don't require business license. I do not anticipate the board starting that program for this purpose.
I know I know of at least one jurisdiction that they also do have a city business license tax, but in addition to that, they require cannabis businesses to get what they call a cannabis business CPOB or something, cannabis business operators permit. And I wonder whether that, without, doing something for all businesses in Lake County, that might be something that gets associated.
Is that different than the actual land use permit?
It's different than the use permit, yes.
Interesting.
There's a use permit, a business permit, and then this cannabis business operators permit.
Do you know which jurisdiction that was?
City of Alameda.
I would add as well, it depends on whether it's in the city or unincorporated, what options are available.
Right.
But yes, I mean, in a jurisdiction where there is a use permit and a license, you could theoretically have two different entities involved. One entity on the license, one on the permit.
Yeah, but City of Alameda doesn't have a local cannabis tax either. They just pay their regular business, their 0.12, business tax
Okay.
to the city. But it is an additional permit level that's cannabis specific, so.
This is Jennifer Smith again. Do you guys have anything to say before I jump back in? Okay. So, I'm trying to think of how it's actually working right now in the real world. And in my example, I lease the property separate from so I lease the property. And then I have an operating agreement with the permit holder, who's the landowner. And that permit currently is in both of our names. But within our operating agreement, it states that sole liability for the canopy taxes are the operator's responsibility. So is there any way that the department could hold that operating agreement as the guarantee and designation of who's responsible for those?
So normally the Treasurer Tax Collector's Office does not get involved in an agreement between parties. Typically, almost all debt we pursue is jointly and severally owed. For instance, in property tax, often there are contracts and deals made where one party has assumed liability for paying that tax. But the fact is, the county will ultimately take the property to auction regardless of who pays it, or, we simply care that it was paid, and we leave it up to the different parties to recover against the offending party, because we just can't get involved in recovery and enforcing that agreement between those. So that would be unusual. I've never really seen a county dive into that level of management, trying to understand the relationship between the parties and who's taking responsibility.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead and show what was brought up on the state.
So in the cannabis general order for the state water boards, there is an area that reads, dischargers and/or landowners remain responsible for any water quality degradation that results from cultivation-related activities, whether coverage under this general order has been terminated or not. So it names both parties, the discharger as an applicant and/or landowner.
And the DCC regs for that.
It's a little different.
While she's looking for DCC, were there any further questions?
So
I guess I have a question. So kind of like looking at this, like if this was the direction our recommendation, the board approved it, went forward, how would that impact people who are currently like already licensed or permitted?
The way I understand it is this is an attempt to make it easier for treasurer, tax collector, staff to know who's involved and who would have responsibility for tax payments. Is that right? Are we on? I'm on the right page. Okay. So now I totally forgot your question. What was it?
So people who already have permits and are operating. So
Okay.
say if this became a requirement that the landowner then had to be on the approved list or whatever,
Mhm.
would like I guess would it be for new applicants and then you'd catch those people who are currently in operation up when they renew?
Yes.
Or would there
No,
be like
actually,
a
we could
period
probably-
of time where they have to come into compliance?
It would be relevant for new applicants, and then when we do our annual monitoring, we can just let them know that this is new information that we're going to need. It's not the same as background checks, so it wouldn't cause their disqualification or revocation of their permit. It'd just be additional information that we need, right? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, and I don't think it would necessarily, I mean, I'm trying to think of any other immediate changes. I agree. I don't think there would be any other immediate changes for people, but certainly as renewals went through, that's when it would.
Well, any new, yeah, and that's not a renewal, just being real careful about our words. It would be an annual monitoring.
Okay.
So renewals for issued cannabis permits are once every 10 years. I don't think we want to wait that long. Yeah, so, good. Okay, any other questions at task force? Because let's go to public input. Go ahead, Tom.
Hi, Tom Lasik. Just a couple comments and maybe a question. I recall in the January 14th update from the Cannabis Task Force to the board, it seemed to be made clear the board does want somehow to have it tied to the land and to landowner. So my question is, I think Mr. Sullivan has articulated, the issue and the Byzantine layers that he has and his staff have to go through. What are the specific recommendations that you want to see in order to tie to the land and get the tax money that the county's rightfully owed?
So what I can identify is that there's Department of Cannabis Control regulations. There's two primary sections that I was looking at. It's 15,007-15 007 and then 15,004-15 004. And that is respectively landowner approval and financial interest in a commercial cannabis business. I would propose that we essentially borrow the language from those two sections. There's a few small modifications that have to be made because, as I was stating earlier, this is a use permit versus a license. So there's a few modifications to have it make sense given that change in type. But I mean, we could return with, or I'm happy to provide other suggestions. And I know CDD staff was looking at it. I think today I was just hoping to bring this concept forward and understand how that fit in and whether that is an appropriate course of action. So it'll be those two DCC sections, and then what Ms. Claiborne referenced, the Water Board and their regulations. They have regulations within their discharge order, and the piece she referenced would also require a few small modifications just to adapt it over to meet this broader definition of permit that we're using here. So collectively, it's the DCC regulations and the Water Board regulations as stated.
Tom, did you have anything else?
Well, yes, just a question on a scenario where perhaps you have a property owner and then the property owner and some other entity enters into an LLC to operate a cannabis operation on that land. If that LLC goes defunct, in the current situation, is the property owner, is the county able to go to the property owner to get the taxes that are owed, or is that tied to the LLC?
So I understand your question. I think I'm just limited because we have active ongoing cases. I'm somewhat limited in my ability to respond to that. What I would say is that I think what we're proposing helps clarify the language for all parties involved and put everyone on notice, and that's what I'm hoping to do here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. We're also going to pull up those citations because the water board one talks about water quality and discharge, not so much taxation or ownership of permit or license. So the state has moved all their stuff over to Westlaw, so it's not as easy to navigate as it was before. So Mary will just take a moment. But just to make sure that for the minutes we have those citations, Claire, could you read those again? I have 15715 point, or
Well,
.007.
15007,
15007.
and then 15004.
004. I thought you said 15715. What was that?
I did. That was
Okay.
completely off kilter.
Okay. Well, these two make better sense then. Okay. One moment. We're going to get those regulations up for you.
An important water board regulation to note also is 15003, owners of commercial cannabis business. This does hold a 20% aggregate shareholder ownership. And this includes an individual who manages, directs, or controls the operations of the commercial cannabis business, including but not limited to a member of the board of directors or a nonprofit, a general partner of a commercial cannabis business that is organized as a partnership, a non-member manager or managing member of a commercial cannabis business that's organized by a limited liability company, the trustees and all persons who have control of the trust and or the commercial cannabis business that is held in trust, and the chief executive officer, president or their equivalent, an officer, director, vice president, general manager or their equivalent. And additionally, if the commercial cannabis business is owned in whole or in part by an entity and the entity includes individuals who manage, direct, or control operations of the commercial cannabis business as described in subsection A to E, those individuals shall also be disclosed as owners.
Okay, so the way that this agenda item is worded, just before we keep going with public input, is it's a presentation and consideration. However, we're giving you a kind of a fire hose of code that you aren't seeing before you. What I would recommend is taking no action on this yet. We still need the public input that's, I think, waiting. Don't we have hands raised in Zoom? Okay, so let's get that. But then let's get these codes printed out and added to an agenda, and maybe we can take action on them next week. Go ahead, Will.
Just noticing there appears to be a member of the public in the room as well who wishes to still speak.
Excellent, thank you.
I have one thing.
Yeah.
So because we're not going to take action on it today because it is a lot of information.
It's only my suggestion. It's kind of up to you guys.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we all agree with that.
Okay.
Is it possible to get between now and the next meeting or whenever, is it possible to get maybe like the proposed recommended, like something that kind of summarizes these code sections that are being referenced and like what Lake County wants to see? Like what does the tax collector's office want to see that would kind of help resolve some of these issues?
Yes, our staff will get with Patrick to make sure that what we add to the agenda is in line with what he's hoping we'll do. We'll also have those citations so that you can see what he was referring to in the first place. Yeah. And that'll be good because it'll be available to the public. Everybody can take a look at it before you guys take any action. Let's continue with public input. Bill, go ahead and state your name for the record.
Bill Wilson. Along the same lines, trying to determine landowner or renter as being responsible, the California Department of Cannabis Control says any cannabis business has to have a minimum of $1 million insurance. If there's any damage, who is that? Is it the landowner? Is it the renter? Who has the liability for the insurance? And is that checked to see that there's insured?
I'm not sure about that because I would defer that to the state, since it's the state regulations you're saying, right, for for insurance. We do not have that same requirement at the county.
Even though it's a state regulation? Under the California Department of Cannabis Control says that any business cannabis has to have a minimum, and there is higher for other businesses.
In our conditions of approval, we would say that the permittee does need to comply with all state regulations as well, even though we may not enumerate them out on the conditions of approval.
But I mean, if there's water erosion and there's damage and there's a claim against them, that becomes the state problem?
The county would not work with that one. We'd be dealing with violations of our own conditions of approval, but management of state licenses is left to the state.
So the county does not require any insurance for liability for a cannabis business?
I don't think we have that in our, we have a, don't we have a bond for reclamation? That's still just, yeah, still just being considered. So no, not at this time, we don't.
Because we're having trouble determining who is the owner for taxes or the renter, it would seem insurance carrier should be the same person. That's what I just like to say.
Thank you. Any further input in the room? Seeing none, we'll go to Zoom. All right, no hands raised. Let's bring it back to the task force. Oop, now we have Andrew. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew Dobbs Kramer. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I understand the challenging problem that the tax collector's office is faced with here, and I appreciate them bringing this forward so that we can all come to some constructive solutions here. I would just say, sort of following up on the question by Commissioner Vanderwall about what happens to those in process. I think we want to be really careful about, making some new requirement that, may jeopardize permits where people have already worked with their landowner and gotten their use permit, and, been in the program successfully for years. I think if we're going to add a new requirement for existing permittees, we should be really careful about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other hands? Go ahead, Angela.
Thank you, Maria. So I think that, and I said this the first time that this came around, that since the tax collector's ultimate final recourse is auction, if something does go wrong and the permit runs with the land, that the landowner should be listed. Until that changes, the tax collector's office shouldn't have to struggle trying to figure out this web of LLCs. To ask Mr. Sullivan, is there any possibility of using the FinCEN identifier number through the Corporate Transparency Act? I don't know if that's been considered, or if it can be used. But as long as these permits run with the land, the landowner needs to be held liable for it if something happens. Thank you.
I think I know what you're referencing with FinCEN, but that's more of a federal matter. We don't really get involved with that, other than my understanding is that was also an effort to create more transparency. For us, we're just more focused, as was stated, that the use permit runs with the land, and so tying liability back there.
I believe those new regulations were also pulled back permanently over the weekend, so.
If I understand correctly, we currently do require property owner authorization on the permit application. So we do have that information, but what we're here about today is when that starts turning into LLCs and financial interests that are part of the permit. Is that correct? Okay, so our basic landowner, lessee, well, you'll have your own operating agreement between you two, but we're usually pretty clear. It's not like this comes up with every single permit application, right? It's just for the more complicated ones where it looks like we've got multiple entities all sort of crisscrossing each other and looking for when tax liability or tax payment becomes an issue, correct?
And we're dealing with parties in these situations where when there is a default or a foreclosure, where they're all arguing with our office over who's liable, and everyone is trying to get out of it, and often over what may be a small amount of revenue, we're expending a lot of time and resources.
Right. So the majority of the work of the Cannabis Ordinance Task Force is actually just updating the current policies that we have so that we're synchronous with the state, and we've sort of we're making recommendations for adaptations based on lessons learned over the last few years of Lake County cannabis policy. However, one of the things that this task force also has to think about is shoring up where we are now finding that we've had problems over the last few years. And so that's really the purpose of Patrick's visit today. This isn't going to, I don't think it would have impacts on many of our existing permits now anyway. But it will enable staff, we'll get right to you, Margot, just a moment. It will enable staff to have a less of a demand should problems arise. Okay, good. And we're still in public input. Go ahead, Margot.
Thank you, Maria. This is more of a question for Mr. Sullivan. Well, in our current ordinance for cannabis commercial cultivation, the application requires all the information concerning an entity to lead back to a person, to a human being. So does that mean that the current application is not meeting the tax treasurer's needs? We're not finding a real human at the end of the paperwork? And if that's the case, does that mean that part of the application is not effective and we have to just go to something completely different? Thank you.
I think what's happening is that there's more parties involved in these businesses than we've typically dealt with in other county operations. So there's more players. I mean, with this one being the example, that there can be multiple LLCs tied in. So sometimes the information we have is limited, and I don't even think it's necessarily that anyone misrepresented anything. It's just that there are so many more entities involved, and because of the nature of this permit, we really, for instance, in the example given, we really need to know who all of these folks are that meet these designations.
The general reason why cannabis businesses often have so many different LLCs is because you have to have ones that are plant touching and ones that are non-plant touching for financial reasons because of federal law. So a lot of times it's not necessarily an attempt to obfuscate. It's because the nature of the federal legality makes it so that this is the money touching entity and this is the plant touching entity, and they can't be the same.
That is helpful. Currently in our in the regulations, it does, under applications, it lists applicant. It does have, like Margot was pointing out, that it lists sort of the most commonly found entities, the corporations, limited liability companies, limited partnerships, or trusts. It does recognize that they could be multi-layered and interlocking, and says if that is the case, documents for those other related entities are needed until the individual natural persons who manage, own, or control those entities can be identified. It doesn't talk about financial interests. So it could be just that we can sort of shore up that gap by adding more detail into applicant, but just so that the task force and the public have a time to think about this and comment, we'll also add this excerpt of, we being Mary, we'll add this excerpt of that portion of the code so that you can see what we currently require. We may be able, as a task force and the public, to sort of identify where those gaps are and make a simple change to the existing. Good, thank you. Are there any other people in the room wanting to comment? Nope. How about anybody from Zoom? Any hands left? Okay, we'll bring back to the task force. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
This is really helpful. Mary will be reaching out to you sometime for the next week.
I'll be available.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks
And
for
so
coming in.
just to recap, what we're having is existing code. We will have those 2 citations from DCC as well as the water board citation, and as well as a recommendation from the Treasurer Tax Collector's Office on any recommendation for amendments to the existing code. Thanks, Patrick. Okay, what's next? We will try to bring that back for next week. Sometimes it's not possible. If not, we'll get it on the next earliest agenda. Yeah. I don't want my staff to go home crying at the end of the day. You're welcome. Next item 6. Some of the leftover non-crossed out topics. Do you want to talk about did we talk about formal withdrawal of an approved project on a voluntary basis? So this would be an actual permit. You have talked about that before, right?
We've touched on this, however, we haven't gone into depth for discussion and public comment for this item.
And are we talking formal withdrawal that's permanent as well as temporary? We've talked some about the temporary fallowing and things like that, right?
This is different from the opt-out or reduced canopy options that are available. We encountered this situation when the permittee maybe has a falling out with the landowner and wants to just shut that permit down because they want to step away from the permit/license.
At that location.
But it doesn't just, there is no, currently the only ways that a permit can end is through 2 years of non-use or revocation. There's nothing in our code that would allow for an active use permit to cease immediately upon request of the permit holder.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about today.
All right. Yeah, and I think I asked for this one because I think my name used to be next to it for a while, so.
If you had not asked for it, we would have asked for it anyway,
Okay.
because
It's
this
an
is
issue.
something that we have encountered over the last few years.
Yeah.
That can be problematic, because just because that permit holder steps away, that use permit is still active for 2 years. And so that permittee has had grave concerns about what the landowner's going to do with this permit. And it also creates a gap in our records because we have to make sure any changes in the business are reflected, or, any necessary new background checks are done also.
Mhm.
So yeah, administratively, it's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important just for the land use and because the market itself is so volatile right now, that for landowners, for business holders, there has to be a process for this. Unfortunately, I wish it was not the case, but if it were booming right now, then there may have been, mergers and transfers and those kinds of things where you would have run into this, so.
And this is not the same sort of change to the text that we've been looking for. This is more of a thematic conversation, and any recommendation from the task force would look something like, take a look at the other areas in the zoning code and add an option in whatever article that is that handles expirations and revocations. Add wording to that article that would add the possibility for permittee-led requests for closure or expiration of the permit. So
Could this be withdrawn?
Yep.
Jennifer Smith. Could this be withdrawn on a without prejudice type scenario? And what would be the process if we do allow this for reinstating the permit? And does the clock keep ticking from the original date or reactivation date?
The with or without prejudice is typically a denial of the project or a revocation. Well, no, actually not. A revocation is different. So I don't know that it would need to have with or without prejudice. If a use permit expires, it's automatically, they could reapply next week.
Okay.
Yeah, so it would not put any lasting, that's not the right word, bad effects, negative effects on any options or opportunities for people in the future.
Okay. This might go back to the previous conversation, but who's going to have the right to withdraw this permit? The landowner or the operating
Permittee or,
permittee.
It's a really good question.
Mm-hmm. Because it's of value to the property.
Yeah, that's something that we'd have to, that's something that you may want to add to your recommendation as thoughts. Because this is going to take, should the board want this, it would take some ongoing discussions between staff and county council to figure out how to word it correctly. So the kind of things then that would be a task force recommendation would be, we support this option, however, these things you really want to keep in mind.
And then I would agree, proof of withdrawal from the state as well. Site remediation, I'm still gonna ask for details on what that is. And I think we've talked about all outstanding fees need to be paid, otherwise they'll keep accruing, correct?
Mhm.
May I? With that site remediation is required section, Jennifer, you actually provided me a site closeout inspection report from Calaveras County. And I think that that's something that code enforcement and the planning division staff can get together on and schedule a site closeout to determine if there are any needs that are going to need to be met for that site before it can officially be closed out, instead of requiring site remediation. Because as previously discussed by the task force, there could be some improvements that a property owner would want to keep to that land. And we wouldn't want to take those opportunities away from a landowner if they did want to keep those improvements in place. So with a site closeout inspection with planning and code enforcement, we could ultimately determine if there are things that need to be corrected on site. This would be potential illegal grading, open and outdoor storage, rubbish, things like that that could be identified on site. We could move forward with that, and should there be a need to go even further, we could issue code enforcement notices of violation for those to be moving through that process instead of requiring site remediation as kind of a blanket statement and not taking into consideration of improvements that are being put in place that the property owner may want to keep. Thanks.
Will Weiss, I have another question, but it probably was better asked with Patrick in the room. I'll still ask it. He had described like a 15% share threshold for some of these elements related to the tax burden, and I guess I'm curious if there's going to be a similar threshold considered for site remediation responsibility. Does that make any sense?
That makes good sense. We could add that to, I like the closeout checklist, because this is something that would be initiated by either permittee or landowner. And so we could create an internal process to verify that all conditions of approval are currently in good standing prior to approving a closure of that use permit. That makes sense. Any other questions? If not, we're going to move on to public input. Is there anyone in the room who has any comments on this item? Nope. Seeing none. Any hands raised? Currently none. Okay. So where do we want to go from here on this item? Would you like to take action on any of this, on this particular part today? Would you like to see us come back with a checklist? Or actually, that's kind of getting in the weeds. Does the task force want to take a position on this or issue any recommendations?
I'd like to ask what would be helpful for staff, since what we're trying to do is get to a point where we can kick it back to you. What is it that you need from us?
Thank you. It would be helpful to know if the task force supports staff looking into or creating a way that the permittee could voluntarily expire or close the use permit.
I would be interested in that further work being done and presented. I think that this
Okay.
is something that
Same.
needs to happen.
Good. And are there any other cautionary recommendations that would be attached to this, such as protecting the interests of, wasn't that something you were just saying that I didn't write down?
Oh, I was just curious of who's going to have the right or the ability to withdraw this.
Okay, that's a question.
If there's a landlord and tenant dispute or something like that, can the landlord come in and say, I'm withdrawing your permit?
That's another question. Does the task force have a position, like protecting the best interests of the permittee or something like that?
I think this is going to have to go back to the chicken and the egg, you know, and should the, who's the permit holder? And is the landowner on that permit?
Patrick.
Good. No, that's still us. Additionally, the landowner isn't necessarily hold the state license, and doesn't that make a difference?
That is completely different, and
Right.
you know, whoever the operating agent, you know, operating group of the state licenses is really unrelated to the withdrawal of the local permit.
Okay,
'Cause they could be
maybe we
separate.
need to look at that. Because if the state licensee is different than the permittee, do they just, they can already voluntarily revoke their state license, right? Right, just not renew it, they don't have like a withdrawal or a cancellation?
Looks like we have member of the public.
Louis, come on up, we can still do.
I just have
We're
something
going back to
add
public input?
Because I think this is kind of a nuanced topic, because, I mean, you could have a situation where you have a cultivator who's maybe just like up and left, and then you have the property owner who maybe decides they don't want that permit on their property anymore.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of different scenarios that could be played out to where it's like property owner should have first right to do it, or, you know, if somebody's actively cultivating cannabis there, maybe they should have the first right. I think there's a lot of different scenarios
Totally.
that could be
Yeah.
played out.
Yeah.
It's almost if there is if there's a landowner consent on the permit for that, so it's, you know, that landowner consent is registered with you guys. So you would have to know, like, this cannot be withdrawn without both landowner and operator consent, or if there is an operator, the operator can't withdraw the local permit without the landowner, because you're affecting somebody's property value.
If it's okay, we'll go back to public input. Go ahead,
sorry.
Louis.
Yes, Louis Lincoln. I would suggest that the county puts a time limit on the mediation of the landowner and the grower, because you'll have things sitting. So like in 60 days, if this isn't resolved, it's gone, you know what I mean? It revert back to the landowner's choice, I guess, because he's gonna be the one, you're talking about taxes, right? Who's responsible?
Well, now
They
we're
should-
actually back to the permit itself.
Right. So if you know, county tax wants to make somebody who is actually responsible, a person, entity, or whatever, if they can't resolve the agreement, if it's a lease or rental, then there should be a time limit. Hey, 30 days, if you don't resolve this, your permit's gone. And it reverts back to the side of the landowner. You know what I mean? Because they're not necessarily doing the cultivation, but they're allowing it. Like I said, somebody gets up and leaves. What happens? Well, he's responsible for the taxes, so he should have say over what happens on the property, and have a time limit. If it's not resolved, you can't come to a conclusion if you want to remove it or do this. Reverts back to the counties, and the permit is no longer void, or it's null and void, or whatever you want. But there should be a time set, because you're the ones who issue it, and if these two guys can't come together and have an agreement, then you shouldn't have it sitting for 6 months and trying to get them to agree on whether to withdraw it or not. There
Or
should
2 years.
Yeah,
Right,
there should be a
exactly,
set time limit, because it's a firm decision if you're gonna cultivate or not, because there's financial ties to that. So giving them an ultimatum, like, hey, you can't come to agreement, then this is, in 60 days or something, the permit's terminated and blah, blah, blah. And here's how you can reinstate it. And that goes back to whoever's financially responsible, the landowner or the business, or however that looks. But that'd be my suggestion on that.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Seeing none, I think we had a hand raised in Zoom. Go ahead, Andrew.
All right, thank you, Andrew Dobbs Kramer. I think in considering both the permit withdrawal issue, the remediation, site closure issue, and the tax issue. What I keep coming back to is I think that the simplest answer here is to have, ultimately what the county does now, which is require that the applications trace back to real humans and make those people liable. And I think having whoever that is defined at the outset of the application, those are the people who are going to be liable throughout that permit's life. Those are the ones who can decide whether to withdraw, and those are the people who are ultimately responsible for the taxes. I think that's the simplest answer here. I think trying to add more people in when we're hearing that one of the challenges is we have too many potential responsible parties. I think adding additional ones might add more confusion rather than less, versus just saying the permit tracks back to this person is ultimately responsible. I think that could go for both the withdrawal and the tax issue, as well as condition compliance. I think when we start to kind of diffuse the responsibility across multiple parties, it becomes easier for it to be ambiguous.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other hands? Go ahead, Autumn.
Hi, Autumn Carsey. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I know at the state level, our manufacturing license goes through a lot more rigorous identification as to who owns each entity. And you have to trace back every person, their stake in each entity, and kind of list everything for the DCC. I think that might be an appropriate way to go here. So if you look at the rules and regulations under manufacturing licenses specifically, investigation that goes on at the DCC level. So you might borrow language from that to identify the appropriate parties and be transparent.
Are you talking about the last item, the taxation item, or do you think that this similar process would relate to withdrawal or
I think
cancellation?
transparency, you have to know who's withdrawing the application, right? Or who would be eligible to withdraw the application.
Okay. Thank you.
And I know we covered taxation already, but I just wanted to say that in terms of if we're making landowners responsible for taxes, so if there's a property that's a fairly large farm and they owe $100 or $200 or $300,000 in their annual tax bill, and that property owner is only garnering, anywhere from $2,500 to $3,500 per canopy acre for that license, I could see a lot more landowners pulling back and not wanting to permit farms or lease to permitted farms, because I've just never seen any county that would hold a property owner liable.
Can you hold on to that comment and make it when it comes back? Because we're already on to the other item.
Yep,
awesome.
No problem.
Thank you. Did you have anything else?
No.
Okie-doke. Any other hands? Okay. Bringing it back. Nobody in the room. Bringing it back to the task force. Again, looking for sort of a holistic kind of recommendation of we're not going to get this all hashed out in one meeting, nor do I think it's really the task force responsibility to get to the nitty-gritties. Some of it will go into an ordinance, some of it will probably be internal policy. So just a stating of task force recommendation would be helpful.
I think ultimately, Jennifer Smith, I think ultimately I'd like to see this determined prior to approval of the permit in some sort of sign off by all entities who is ultimately responsible for taxes and who is ultimately allowed to revoke a license. I think because we have learned so much over the last few years that we're seeing these data points that we need probably at the very beginning of this process, and that's going to help your team.
Sure. I think identification, just like the last item, identification of actual people will be helpful both there and in this particular item. What I'm looking for is does the task force support development of regulations that would enable voluntary withdrawal of a permit,
Yes.
an approved permit?
Yes, I do. I mean, but
Is that a
I-
motion?
You can make the motion?
Sure, I'll move accordingly.
Okay,
You need more detail than that?
no.
Okay.
We have a motion, do we have a
Second.
second? Nara, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion passes. Excellent. Operational hours, delivery hours, construction hours.
That one's crossed out on mine.
Is it?
Yeah.
This here, this section will be moved in the next meeting due to lack of time. Did we make any decision? I don't see a
Thought we made
decision.
a lot of time decisions on that, no?
Ruby, do you remember from minutes? I don't have that off the top of my head.
We had 3 sets of different types of operating hours based upon commercial deliveries, deliveries for supplies, and actual business hours.
I remember
There it is,
that.
number 4. It's
Oh,
all
I'm
blue.
am I looking on the wrong section? Okay.
Page 10.
Page 10. I'm on page 7. Where the heck what am I doing? Oh, I'm in minutes. Jeez, sorry. Page 10. Good. That was done. Okay, that's still minutes.
Page 14.
Thank you. Would be good if the person leading this meeting is on the right page. Excellent. Good, never mind. We're done with that one. Do we want to touch odor yet, or do we want to go to RVs?
I think we did RVs too. Didn't we?
I don't see any action taken.
I think we were looking for staff input on the RV
Oh,
item.
that's right.
I can speak to the RV item. The recommendations were brought to the Board of Supervisors, and they entertained the discussion. However, it was mentioned by one of the supervisors that they do not want to see RVs at commercial cannabis cultivation sites, that they would prefer to see something like a construction temporary office rather than having a multitude of RVs out in the hills.
There is currently no allowance for someone to live in an RV outside of an RV park or a campground, and that's because of the need for basic health and safety regulations or systems in place.
I think this is one of those things that should remain consistent with county policy. We shouldn't carve out an exception for a cannabis farm.
This is up for discussion questions before we take public input.
Sounds good. I'm good with, yeah.
Okay. Public input. Anybody in the room? RVs on site? Anybody hand raised?
I mean, it even seems like it shouldn't be in cannabis regs. It's just.
No, I think we brought it to you only because it was an issue that we found in annual monitoring, yeah. Who's in Zoom? Okay, go ahead, Autumn.
Yeah, I just wanted to notate in a specific circumstance where RVs can be used for temporary offices, not necessarily someone living in them. And it makes it easy to tow them up to the property and tow them out when you're done with the cultivation cycle. So I know those offices that they're referring to, similar to like schools use them and kind of temporary mobile offices, those can be very, very expensive compared to an RV. So I think if it's just used as an office space, it shouldn't be an issue, but no one should be living in them, inconsistent with county policy.
Thank you, Autumn. Before we go on to the next one, the current code does allow for use of a travel coach, which would include an RV as a temporary office. That's already in place. Next
So we're not talking about doing away with that.
Right. No, we're talking about temporary workers moving their RVs to a permit site.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Farm labor quarters, however, just so everybody knows, does include the option for trailer coaches. Yep, and farm labor camps, but we have permits for those. So there could be an option then for a cannabis permittee to apply for these types of things.
Is that in the code? Or is that something that the county would accept currently, or would we
Farm
have
labor
to add it to
camp,
the code?
yes. Farm labor quarters would require a recommendation from the task force and approval by the board that we modify the criteria, because that has a certain amount of agriculture activity required on site. None of it includes cannabis. So I think we've touched on this before about adding an amount of cannabis that would then qualify a permittee to apply for farm labor camp.
Right, because there's a certain amount of acreage that has to be planted, and
Yeah, it's like
cannabis
10
is
acres of
different
walnuts,
than,
or so many pigs or something. I don't know. It's already in there. But so a recommendation we would be looking for from the task force is if staff should modify the criteria required for farm labor quarters to include cannabis activity, permitted cannabis activities. That's just one thing. We're not done talking yet, though. I'm not looking, because I want to make sure we get all the public input. Anybody, any other hands raised? Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Given the higher value per acre of cannabis, I would be in favor of seeing some attempt to approximate that with the farm labor quarters in order to allow folks to apply for farm labor quarters with, a cannabis farm that produces the equivalent revenue of whatever the threshold is for other agriculture. I know that maybe an acre to acre comparison might be.
Andrew, you're really quiet. Can you cozy up to that microphone, please?
Sorry, can you hear me a little better now?
Yep, that's better. Thanks.
Great. So I just would be in favor of some way of allowing cannabis growers the same rights that every other farmer has, which is to apply for these farm labor quarters. Given the higher value per acre of cannabis than other crops comparatively, I think the threshold should be lower, obviously, for the acreage. I don't know if there's a way to capture that higher value per acre in that sort of acreage to farm labor quarters requirement that there is baked into the code. But I, for one, would be in favor of seeing that same right that's available to every other farmer in the county be extended to cannabis cultivators.
Any other hands? Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. We're just, Mary found that part of the code, so I'd like her to read to you sort of what we're looking at as far as conventional ag standards. Go ahead.
I do believe we touched on this item a little bit quite some time ago, but the uses for farm labor quarters include 50 dairy or purebred cows or 100 beef cattle, or 20 acres of grapes, apples, pears, walnuts, or prunes, or 20,000 broiler chickens, 15,000 egg-laying hens, or 3,000 turkeys, or 15 brood mares, or wholesale nurseries with either 1 acre of propagating greenhouse or 3 acres of field-grown plant materials or containers. Or, and it continues to list ag uses primarily to animals. But there is one area that states any other agricultural use or combination of uses which the planning director, in consultation with the agricultural commissioner, determines to be of the same approximate agricultural value and intensity as above.
I would really love it if you would not leave that to me.
I mean, it seems to me if you're Jennifer Smith, if you've got a commercial permit, thereby you are a business and you should be allowed to have farm labor housing just by that standard alone.
We have a number of different permit levels for cannabis. We have cottage type C, 2,500 plants. Does that qualify?
I mean, if it's a remote location, and even if it's run by a family, it's possible that during harvest that family may need to move an RV up, closer to be nearer the grow. So I would think even a cottage, particularly because often that is just a family, or, 1 or 2 or 3 people.
Okay.
Any?
Will?
So respectfully to those who've spoken on the task force, but also Mr. Dobbs Kramer, I wonder if there isn't also a consideration for the number of workers needed. I mean, I realize there's a vast difference in the value of these crops per acre, and that's actually true for all the uses listed independent of cannabis, but there's also simply a consideration for how many human beings might be needed. And I think harvest is the, well, I guess harvest and planting in cannabis would be the two heavy use times, but I don't pretend to know exactly. Either way, it seems like the need for housing is proportional to the need for workers, not the dollar value of the crop per acre. Just a thought.
Okay. So a farm labor quarter is one dwelling unit per all of those pigs and chickens and stuff. A farm labor camp is a larger group. Well, yeah, it's a larger grouping of dwelling units, but it's also seasonal, isn't it? Or not always?
Not always, but frequently.
Okay.
And isn't, if I'm not mistaken, Will, if you have designated licensed farm labor quarters, you're actually able to rent that out to other crops employees, correct?
That's correct.
You mean camp or an actual quarters? Because farm labor quarters are there permanently. Those are dwellings.
Sorry, I should have clarified camps as the terminology is being used here
Well,
today.
that's cool. I didn't know that.
So,
It's a business.
yeah, I mean, it can be. And I think I'm aware of instances, not at all my own business, but I'm aware of instances where a labor camp may be occupied close to year-round by a group of people who will work in various crops. And that can be, as far as I understand it anyway, across both cannabis and non-cannabis lines. But so far as I understand it from this conversation, there are not farm labor camps located on cannabis properties presently. And I think that's what we're discussing.
Not that we know of.
Not that,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Or not that have been applied for yet. Yeah.
It gets to be about the same thing. Yeah. Okay. So, what we would be looking.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I notice a member of the public is interested in speaking. In the room.
Okay. Let's go back to public input.
Hi, Louis Lincoln. Just to touch, like, you have different crops. You have a seasonal outdoor, which is, you might need it at the beginning and the end, but you have light dip that is every 3 months. So, you know, somebody's doing a number of greenhouses. Those are thousands of pounds that if he's hiring people to hand trim, you know, you're going to need those on the regular. And then you have the seasonal outcrop is like 6 months, 5, 6 months, where it's in the beginning and the end. So you have a number of different growing scenarios to consider when issuing a permit or something of that nature for workers. It's like, hey, this permit is every 90 days, you're going to need something. Once every 2 months or 3 months, or is it once in the beginning and once in the end? And that dictates the use of workers.
Right.
So, and the quantity, how much are you processing? How is it being processed? Machine, you could obviously get it done faster, or is it hand trimmed and you're going to need this amount of time? This is for the quality of the product.
Thank you, Louis. Any other hands? Okay, we still have Bill here.
Hey, Bill Wilson again. I think you need to differentiate between the housing. If they are a house, it should be connected to sewer systems and water systems that pass the health department. The building should be inspected and pass building codes. That would be farm housing. If it was RVs that come in for a harvest season, I mean, how long do their tanks hold the sewage? You know, that would be a temporary thing, but I think we have to determine if it's hooked up to legal septic tanks and legal water systems, that would have a longer time period for people to be in them because they would be legal that way. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So what we would be looking for from the task force as far as a recommendation is if they support allowing cannabis permittees to apply for farm labor quarters and farm labor camps. I think that overall would be fine as far as a recommendation. Secondarily, if you have, if the recommendation is any level of cannabis permit should be able to apply, or if there's a size minimum. So far, what we've heard is any cannabis permit.
I think we should be allowed to apply as an agricultural product and stand by all the building codes that are required and laws that are required for the various types of housing.
Clarifying question on that? Is that pertaining, first of all, is that a motion?
Are we making motions or are we just talking about direction we'd like to see?
Well, we're done with public input. We've now brought it back for discussion and/or action.
I guess my question is, if we're talking about farm labor dwellings and farm labor camps, but not necessarily RVs.
Yeah.
Because it seems like RVs are a touchy subject, given what we've heard from the Super Board of Supervisors, and I'm interested in what Jennifer recommended, but want to make sure that we're setting the RV thing aside for the purposes of like clarity.
An RV is an option for a farm labor camp. No, farm labor quarters, both. However, it would require a permit for either one of those. And so it would go through the review and making sure that the minimum health and safety standards are in place.
So I think that goes back to the whole conversation and how I would like to see it is whatever the guiding principles are of the county regarding RVs on site and the length and duration, that we adhere to whatever county policy is, up to and including being able to establish farm labor camps and farm labor housing, which may or may not include RVs, but if it does include RVs, we again follow those existing rules. So that we're not carving out anything new or different. We're just making sure that we apply and conform to the rules.
So what I hear...
That's my opinion.
So if I hear it correctly, your motion is existing regulations regarding farm labor quarters and farm labor camps should apply to cannabis permittees as well.
Correct. That would be my motion.
Second.
Did you want any discussion? Because I have a question.
We'll allow that.
Thank you. So on farm labor quarters, there is a certain level of agricultural activity that's required in order to qualify to apply. Do you want a similar level of cannabis activity in order to qualify? And if so, what level?
That's going to vary based upon the type of cultivation, because the smallest cultivation you can have for indoor or mixed light, I believe at the commercial level is, I think, 2,500 square feet. I think it's going to, if you are applying for a commercial cannabis license, then that gives you the right to apply for existing and conforming housing, ag housing. If you have personal grow of your 6 or 12 plants, then no.
Okay. So if I hear correctly, the motion and the second is commercial cannabis permittees, or the regulations applying to farm labor quarters and farm labor camps shall also apply to commercial cannabis permittees.
Yes.
Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Anybody against? That motion carries 4-0. Thank you. Where are we? We're going to take a 5-minute break. Closing up on 3 o'clock, so we have about another hour and 10 minutes to go.
Check 1, 2.
Okay, thank you, thank you. We are now back. So just to recap that last item, self-contained RVs on site. The task force did not take action on self-contained RVs on site in the way that we presented it, but instead just said that where RVs are already listed in the code, which would be farm labor quarters and farm labor camps, that'll apply to cannabis. What's our next thingy? Let's see. Cannabis density of cultivation sites and retail sites. Mary, would you like to talk about this one?
So currently, the code does not have any limitations to the numbers of permitted sites and allowed in proximity to another. This has been a public comment received during several planning commission hearings where we're looking for thresholds of significance. However, there has not been a countywide EIR to determine those thresholds. With that, this is a commonly asked question: how many sites are we going to allow in one area? And this can get pretty deep into the weeds, considering things like water use and traffic. This is something that's being brought before the task force today for consideration or a discussion. And that's the gist of this topic here. So adult use is one of the topics that code enforcement wanted to be present for.
So, forgive me if I'm pulling us backward, but what happened with item number 6 related to odor?
We skipped that one. I think we should start a meeting with that one.
Okay,
That's gonna take a
wasn't sure
while.
if that's, okay.
Yeah, it's
shut
not off the list. It's not crossed off.
I just would imagine certain folks may have come to attend for that item, and so I'd,
Why don't we make sure we take it up next week?
Okay.
Is that helpful?
it's fine with me.
Okay. We are taking it up next week. We are not talking about density. Oh, wait. Jennifer doesn't want us to talk about density.
And I was just trying to get through as much as we can, knowing that
Let's
our
look at
time is
low-hanging
limited.
fruit. Okay.
Yeah, but I would
Opt out
also
and
like to just briefly state, I thought we kind of handled retail density when we addressed the zoning chart.
We did.
We
Yeah,
did.
you've already
So
made
I would like to
recommendation.
change this to just cultivation density conversation.
Yeah, that's true.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, because you're not revisiting
And that was actually already voted through by the Board of Supervisors too, so that went all the way to them.
in concept. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly, sorry.
Do we need any public input on that before we move past it, or are we done? with the-
We've just been,
Just
we're,
check.
we're still on the list. It's still on the list. We're just not talking about it right now. Okay, opt out and reduced canopy process. Yeah, that would be our next one. Or we could go on to other low-hanging fruit, like fallowing. Is that low-hanging?
I think those are both low-hanging together.
Okay.
Um,
Opt out and reduced canopy process.
I would like to see the current process that we have allowed to happen be codified with that June 1st date of the deadline.
So just to clarify for task force and public, currently it's just been an internal policy that was developed by staff to create an avenue for permittees to maintain active use permits, in allowing for the flexibility of business decisions in a volatile market. So they can opt out, so long as they let us know, hopefully by June 1st. They can say, we're not growing this year. We're opting out of our process. And so we hold their permit as active, given that notification, instead of inactive for a year. Other growers have said we need to reduce our canopy or our amount that we're growing. The purpose or the benefit of that is then that we're talking to the tax collector's office too, and both of them, we're communing with communicating with the tax collector's office because it does temporarily alter the tax assessment. So they go off of that lower canopy than what is normal, which would be the maximum amount permitted. Okay, there. Now we're all up to speed and on the same page. Open for task force questions.
Is an inspection and inspection fee still required?
Yes.
Okay, I would like that definitely called out in that.
We still do annual reports, and we do oversight checking to make sure that if they opt out, we're not seeing cultivation. So, because it's important, and just so you know, the tax collector's office, not just ours but statewide, where that is an option, have been finding disturbing reports of people in the metric system of having cannabis but not cultivating that year. So that does, just because they opt out doesn't mean we're not paying attention to them.
Great.
If the task force has no questions, we'll go to public input on this item. Anybody in the room? Seeing none. Any hands in Zoom? Go ahead, Angela.
Thank you, Maria. Sorry, I'm still catching my voice, getting my voice back. I just wanted to point out in the agenda, CAP submitted a letter, and CAP requested that no changes be made to the opt-out and reduced canopy process, and to amend the code for clarification. And yeah, they did. The Board of Supervisors did solidify the resolution in May, making the deadline, opt-out deadline, June 1st. But I wanted to ask, and this will be going into the next thing that's going to come up. How does opt-out or reducing differ from fallowing? So on page 30 of the agenda, we have our letter, and that's one of the questions that we asked in it. We'd like to know how this is going to vary from the current opt-out process for fallowing.
Great question. Thank you. That's probably why Jennifer was saying we could deal with both of these items at the same time. Okay, any other hands? So we'll get to that in just a second, Angela. Hang on to that one. Any other hands in Zoom? Okay, bringing it back. That is a good question. Do we need to address these as separately, or are they similar?
I think they're similar. I think they're the same. Yeah.
Opting out is following, I would imagine. Yeah, that's
okay.
It would just, yeah, the two things would be reduced canopy or opt out entirely, right?
Right.
Is it you're opted out until you declare that you want to opt back in, or is it an annual opt out? I think that needs to be clarified too.
Annual opt out at this time.
Okay.
I always pictured fallowing as like some sort of restorative process on the land also, not just not cultivating on it. Am I wrong? Like in rotating crops, don't you use like a nitrogen fixator or something?
That's true of like field crops, but it's not necessarily true of, I mean, I don't know, you're not wrong in your guess, but it's more true of crops that are lower impact and lower infrastructure bearing, you know what I mean? Like, so fallowing a hayfield is essentially not doing anything with it, whereas fallowing an orchard I mean, you might more readily reach for the term abandoning an orchard than fallowing it, but you might, they could involve the exact same amount of effort, so to speak. But to restore a field to what it had been prior is a costly endeavor if there's a great deal of infrastructure involved. And I think I'll just stop there, but I would welcome anyone else who might have a thought on this.
Do any of our orchard people fallow their orchards?
No, they abandoned them. They abandoned them.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And there's
So in this term, just to make sure that I understand that we're all on the same page, we're really talking about opting out or reduced canopy and not cultivating on, not putting a commercial agricultural sort of burden on that soil for that year. Okay.
And generally, when I would say if it's done on like a rotation basis, that's because you're planning, that's a, well, they're all deliberate, but one of them is deliberate to, replenish the soil. Another is because there may not be the money to purchase the clones or seeds or whatever it is for that year. So maybe we should do an opt-out instead of fallow. But I think the state calls it fallowing though. I'm not.
We're just gonna stick with.
Well, that's just nomenclature. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that members of the public have told me that I think this falls more under site remediation. I mean, is part of where I'm going with this, but I've heard from members of the public who said that they think there should be a higher standard for what returning a site to its original condition was after a grow or a cannabis operation is been abandoned, opted out of. Again, I don't want to like pick the wrong term here, but I think this probably falls more under site remediation, but that's kind of a thought I wanted to make sure I introduce here. Is there are properties that were once, I believe, legal cannabis operations that are now no longer in operation, and I've heard from members of the public, especially on the north end of Lake County, where my seat represents, that they take objection to the extent to which those properties have been restored to their original condition. I also want to point out, though, that is a standard that is it's sort of a double standard, because there are vineyards and orchards in the same northern half of the county that have not been held to that, and so I mean it just feels like those are thoughts worth bringing to the fore here.
We do have a process through the agricultural commissioner, though, regarding abandoned orchards and vineyards, right? 'Cause I've seen it come before the board when they were appealing.
That's specific to the, I think it's pear and
Yeah.
apple orchards.
But nothing else? No walnuts or vineyards?
No,
Okay.
not currently, no.
And it's almost always conditional upon a neighbor complaining. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, that really is what it comes down to.
Because if you're not taking care of your stuff, it becomes like a hub for infectious, all kinds of yucky stuff.
Yeah, rats in an orchard because it's still producing. And I would say, just remembering that the difference between a licensed cannabis operator and an unlicensed one, if it's an abandoned, unlicensed grow, I mean, I do think that it sounds like the county should probably have a policy for that, like you do with other abandoned agricultural sites, and possibly whether it's licensed or unlicensed and abandoned, the impact is the same. It's just that in one case you may be able to actually track down the previous permit holder, and in the other you'd probably have to go through the property owner or whatever that is to track
I think
it back.
getting input on regulations for abandoned cultivation sites is a different topic, but it does raise an interesting question. Does the task force have an opinion on how many years, subsequent years, opt-out should be allowed before the permit is considered abandoned?
I would like to align with the state on that.
What does the state say?
I believe it's 2 years.
Okay.
If
or
you do
whatever
it
the
2 years in a row.
Yeah, or just let's research it and align with it.
Mm-hmm.
It would be my
Yeah, I would
preference.
research an aligner. I would say as long as the person is in otherwise in good standing and still communicating, and there may be more than 2 years of financial hardship.
Does the state have a reduced canopy option?
They do.
year by
Yes.
year?
Yes.
Okay. Would the task force want us to take a look and possibly synchronize with that one also?
You can.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah, it's comes with your annual renewal, your state your renewal, and one of the options is you go through the Excella program or whatever it is, through the DCC. You go through the renewal, but at one point you're able to select non-operational, and I believe that's the status, they call it non-operational.
Okay.
And there's a 80% reduction of fees under that as well.
Before we give it back to you for action, I'd like to ask a question of Angela, since she was speaking for the group of public members that identify as CAP. Angela, you said that CAP supports no changes to the program. However, currently, it's not in the code. Did you mean to say that CAP does not want it to be codified? Or that this group of public members are satisfied with the program as it currently stands?
No, we're comfortable with the program as it currently stands, just to amend the code for clarification with the opt-out deadline date of June 1st.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's
Thank you.
helpful. All right, and is there any other public input? Last check before we bring it back for action. Go ahead, Bill.
Bill Wilson, and not really sure, but a point of order, following to me is an annual crop that you disc and you don't use the ground. Non-fallowing, trees can't do that. They can't just be considered fallowing. But the question I have on the opting out, that would grow for an outdoor grow, but what about greenhouses when you get 3 or 4 crops a year? Is that opting out for one crop, or is that for the whole year? Who regulates that?
Good question. So far, we've been treating it as the whole year.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so there should be, if they opt out, there should be no grows for the whole year in the greenhouse.
Correct.
Okay, and does,
And likewise indoors also.
that's what I mean. And I'm more in indoors because you get multiple crops out of it.
Mhm.
So is that just on the honor system? I mean, if all of a sudden, if it's a complaint driven, then if all of a sudden there's a horrible smell coming and they've opted out?
We would take a look at that.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. And we would also actually do inspections anyway to verify. We do inspections as well on those sites, even if it's not complaint driven, just to verify that there is no cannabis cultivation taking place. Have we had to do it? We only do it once a year. So, but it's a good point. We need to think about the indoors, which we don't have very many of those, that do have those multiple cycles. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Any other public input? Okay.
So that is how the state treats it too. If we're back to the task force. It is, since it's an annual renewal.
More public.
Okay, sorry.
Andrew, go ahead.
Thank you, Andrew Dobbs Kramer. I appreciate the county's current policy and allowance for operators to opt out. I think this is a really important bit of flexibility, especially given how much all of the studies and all of the groundwork in getting a use permit costs. It's very conceivable that an operator might invest significant funds, secure their permit, and then encounter a couple years of financial hardship, but still be dedicated to that project and not want to give up their 10-year use permit. So I think I would be in favor of codifying it as it stands and allowing, as long as the operator is paying their taxes, they're responsive to CDD and doing the other things necessary to be in good standing, they should be able to remain permitted under this limited operations, as the state calls it, throughout the life of their permit, if they so choose. I mean, it would be terrible to lose your investment in your property and your permit and everything else because of 2 years of financial hardship. It'd be devastating.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other hands? Seeing none, bringing it back to the task force. Opt out and reduced canopy. What I've got is a line with state regarding the number of years one can opt out and reduced canopy timelines. The board's already taken a position that the June 1st is that date, which is during the summer, a lot of our staff, our planners are fully engaged in site visits. And the tax collectors, they've got their own other non-cannabis timelines too. So that June 1st is going to really help so that we're not scrambling over last minute opt-outs or reduced. And so that's what I've got.
I think particularly for greenhouse and outdoor, that's pretty reasonable, because if you don't have stuff in the ground by June 1, then you're probably not going to have it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's part of the last date. So
yeah, it is helpful because it's early enough that we're not totally in the thick of all of our site visits. We don't want to. It wouldn't make any sense to do a site visit and then receive an opt out. So keep things moving smoothly. So, supports codification of opt-out, reduced canopy, and align with state regarding how many times as possible. That's what I got. Is that right? Okay, then, if there's no further discussion, take a motion. Sorry, Nara's ruler just totally distracted me.
Move to direct staff to research and align these two items with state rules and inclusive of June 1st deadline with inspections and inspection fees annually.
I second that.
Great. Got a motion and a second. Did you want discussion, or are you ready to vote? All those in favor, vote aye.
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 Any opposed? Seeing none, that motion carries. Is there anything on that next item following that was not covered, Nara? Because it says here that member Dahlbach had to present this item.
Oh, that's the one I was supposed to present, not the opt-out. Okay.
Right.
I think it's following and then canopy reduction in canopy, and I think you all have that.
All right, so is there
Existing.
anything else that has to do with following that we haven't already kind of
I think we've got it.
dealt with? Okay. Just because we're going to cross through this one and not take it up, I just want to make sure we don't have any public input on this item before we cross it off our list. So the question is, any public input on following that may be outside of the opt-out or reduced canopy process anyway? Seeing none in the room, none in Zoom. Good, we're crossing following off. Site reclamation bond. Haven't we been talking about this already? That one seems, is this different than remediation? And
I was
think
probably
there
just, I was probably just using those words interchangeably. My bad.
right, this is what we're talking about, how we already dealt with it today, the internal site checklist. Should that permittee either request or it's starting to look abandoned?
I think this is separate in that we're asking for the site to be remediated, if that's the word we're using, whichever word we choose. This actually requires a bond for that work.
Okay, so this is a bond to secure financing to reclaim or repair the site of closed or abandoned. It would be abandoned. If it's voluntarily closed, they'd be doing it already.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this, the state requires this. There are some counties that require this. I think that this is a nice insurance policy for both the public and the county, and it's a minimal cost to the cultivator. So I would be in favor of this.
How much? Do you have a level?
I think the
I think
only
it's
one that
5 million,
is
isn't
allowed
it,
to
at the
be
state?
issued is $5,000 is the only existing bond.
Oh, okay.
And it's $140 to procure it.
So $5,000 site reclamation bond.
Yeah, and you can get that through any of the.
Any questions from the task force before we take it to the public?
5,000 total or per acre, or is there any sort of?
The way it's
clarification?
issued from the bond company is and the way it's is 5,000 per site, so per APN. Which I get it, it's not a lot of money, but it is all that's offered.
Not on some of our tens of acres of canopy, yeah. But if that's the max of state law, then the question is, can we exceed that? Or is that the max you can get?
That's the max you can get
From the
at the
bond
county level.
Okay.
Or research it. That's been my only experience.
So during the updates to the board, it was also noted by a board member that they were not interested in having us pursue this alleyway because we do have the code enforcement violations and liens available. So I just wanted to share that with you while you have discussion.
Cool.
Okay, far be it for me to contradict the board. However, we also do have a finite budget in code enforcement to do that. And so any expense that's a lien, we may not get back until that property is sold. So I didn't think to say that, actually, when the conversation was going on at the board's level. So I think that maybe, let's keep this one. If the task force supports a recommendation on this one, I'd like to take it back to the board for their further discussion.
And I mean, I don't mean to like put more upon my own industry. I just know that this is something that's asked for consistently in these community meetings. And if it's, you know, it's, for me, I think for the industry, it's a good faith commitment to our community that we, you know, we are going to clean these up and we're willing to make sure it gets cleaned up.
Yeah, and it differentiates the licensed growers from unlicensed. And
So, yeah, go ahead, Will.
Well, I just think there's, as someone who occasionally like uses heavy equipment to fix a site or to do land work on a site, or also to, you know, some of the public input I've heard directly has to do with abandoned hoop houses, for example, right? Abandoned hoop houses are among the greater eyesores that I hear complaints about, and I don't mean to put too fine a point on this, like, I'm sure there are an array of opinions, but it seems to me that, you know, $5,000 may or may not be enough to clean up some abandoned hoop houses. If it were then also a requirement or a necessary step to then, like, do some land work with heavy equipment, you would not come anywhere close to covering those costs. So if 5,000 is somehow a max or a cap that exists at the state level and that's applicable here, then fine. But I think it's worth pointing out that there are a couple of different scenarios that could, you know, need remediation, and I don't know that $5,000 actually comes close to covering some of those. That's all.
As I've been thinking while you're talking, the board may have been comfortable not doing the bond because although we do have a finite budget, we are also stepping up our citation and fine program. So they may be more comfortable with it going through a notice of violation and fines, which would then conceivably be recaptured to the department sooner than the land sale. Not always, but conceivably. So I'm going to leave this one up to the task force. If you'd like to make a recommendation, we'll collect it and take it with everything else. Because I've had some ongoing epiphanies while we've been talking, let's go back to the public and just see if we have any public input. Anybody in the room? Please come on up.
Bill Wilson. Just to clarify, has anybody had difficulty getting bonds? 5,000 seems like a low enough, but insurance companies, federally licensed banks aren't dealing with cannabis. Are bond takers dealing with cannabis? There is not a problem with that.
Mm-mm.
Yeah,
I'll take the money.
Huh?
I said, they'll take the money.
But I mean, at if it was higher level, would you start losing bond takers?
I don't know.
Okay, that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks. And Lewis and Jesse, you don't have to wait for me to call on you. Just if you'd like to do public input, please feel free to approach the microphone.
Yeah, hi, Louis Lincoln. Yeah, I was just thinking it'd be a good option if you have a landowner that is maybe they leasing the land and somebody does something bad and you have that disagreement. As a landowner, if I'm not getting all the revenues, but if they do something wrong as a backup to that, hey, I had to kick them out and this needs to be reclaimed, there was a bond issue that I paid as an owner that can cover some of this cost if they're liable, like you guys are talking about the taxes or about, so there should be an option for somebody like, hey, I have the land, I'm not really doing it, but I'm going to pay for a bond just in case something bad happens. And you know, and I'm not stuck with this huge bill for something I didn't do, you know, but I am part of it. You know what I mean? Like there could be an option for something in this industry where, you know, it helps out people who are having bad actors come in and just kind of fallow their land, you know, and do all these things that has value to it, financial, like he's talking about. To get a backhoe to come in to pull something out, that's, you know, $5,000 easily, one day or 2 days or whatever. But having an option for them would be great that they could choose to, and maybe that's through code enforcement or something. But or when you apply, it's like, hey, would you like an option for this, whatever it is, the license you're holding, if something bad happens or whatever, you know. Depending, I mean, the option out there is good for people that aren't doing the work and doing everything themselves, and they have the land. So that's just my.
Yeah, it's interesting input because through our chapter 13, which is where, our notice of violations and our code enforcement is, the property owner is the one that gets the lien against the property or the notice of violations. So that is good to think about. Yeah,
Hi, Jesse Cood. I'm going to just echo kind of what the last speaker said, that the $5,000 bond is barely enough to probably get the equipment out there and maybe get a day's work out of an operator. And then also, the bonds are relatively cheap. I have friends in the construction industry, and I know in that industry you can get a bond for any amount you want. And I don't know why it would be different. Maybe that's something that should be researched to find out if there are increases that could be made to that $5,000. And then also, I think it's a great idea, just because it takes a lot of the impact off of the staff at the county. You have this in place already. You don't have to go through the process of abating the property and then waiting 5 years to recoup the money at a sale or whatever. That's all I had to say.
Thank you. We have some hands in Zoom. Go ahead, Angela.
Thank you, Maria. So it's sounding like that this might come back with a little bit more information. Can CDD provide information, like historical information since 2018, on how many sites that you guys have had be abandoned and have had to be remediated, and roughly costs, so that we have numbers to look at historically? Is that something that you would have? Or would that be code enforcement?
Great question. So we have had some abandoned sites. They have not been remediated by the county. They've been left there. We don't have a budget to do that right now.
Okay, so are they accruing fines right now?
Not that I know of.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And they're on expired projects too. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I guess maybe that's something that needs to be looked at, and then the fines be assessed. I know the board of supervisors has been quite adamant about assessing more fines, and well, I guess, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. Who's next? Go ahead, Andrew.
All right, thank you. Andrew Dobbs Kramer. I want to just agree with what the supervisors previously stated, which is that there is a mechanism already for this through code enforcement. I also want to just remind everyone that we're talking about adding another mechanism here with the site closeout checklist that we've just discussed today. And it seems like maybe that would be the site closeout checklist, and then, penalties if that's not met. It seems like what we're already talking about today. That seems inherent in having the checklist, is that if you don't check off all the things on the site closeout list, that you would still have some negative repercussions for not completing that checklist. Also, I just want to say, having done cannabis licensing at the state level when Prop 64 passed and first required the bonds, it was not always straightforward to get these bonds, even though they are relatively small for the cannabis industry. Insurers, bond companies are not always super keen on working with the cannabis industry. The $5,000 bonds that are available now became available because the state mandated that we get these bonds. They were not previously available. So to mandate a new type of bond here, it may not be available on the market. We simply might not be able to go get one. Sure, construction companies can get these, lots of companies can get these, but cannabis companies were not able to access the same insurance markets as others typically. So I think pointing to code enforcement, pointing to the site closeout checklist, and being clear about what are the repercussions if people don't finish that checklist and don't close it out, I think would be a simpler mechanism here than trying to involve a third-party insurance company and ensuring that bonds are up to date and everything that goes with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. No further hands in Zoom. We'll bring it back to the task force for discussion and/or action. Not everybody at once.
What is it that you're looking for from us on this?
Okay, so this has been on our agenda for a while, but the board also did say that they're not really interested in this. So what I'm looking for is if the task force thinks it's important enough that you really still want to make a recommendation. Typically, if the board says we're not interested in this, it may not gain a lot of traction. So the background supporting a recommendation should be fairly compelling.
I feel like this is something that could be handled in conditions of approval. That site site cleanup or, closing out of the site would be something that would be added or may already be in the conditions of approval. That site, something like that.
Question, but site cleanup, I mean, I would imagine it's a line item in conditions of approval, but you can't predict the future at the moment you approve a project, right? So it seems to me that in order for there to be accountability and or funds available for this type of stuff, I understand the point about the board has no appetite. Okay, like the board has their option to take action as they choose when they do. I personally think that some sort of site remediation bond or site reclamation bond is an appropriate thing to do. If it's capped at 5,000, then it is, but I'm prepared to make a motion that be included as part of the task force recommendations going forward.
I just want to make sure we're asking people to do something that's possible, because I do remember what Andrew was talking about, helping people get licensed right as regs came through in 2017, 2018. And the state had this surety bond, and we were like trying to find a company that would do a surety bond for a cannabis company. And I don't know, I'm sure there are existing site reclamation bonds. I don't know. That was California-wide, though. And if this is just Lake County, I don't know that there would be enough of a desire for there to be changes on a corporate level at a bond company if they aren't currently doing site reclamation bonds for cannabis specific. And I wonder are there site reclamation bonds in the existing code for hemp or for any other use in the county that would be
We do have them
similar?
for mines. Yep, and geothermal.
And hemp does require a bond.
A reclamation bond, site reclamation?
Mhm.
Okay. We look at.
I'm
yeah.
looking at y'all for consensus on something and or a motion.
If I can ask Nara, like directly, you'd said something a minute ago about how good practice here differentiates legal players from illegal
Right.
players, and I mean, in that spirit is what I'm suggesting. I mean, does that work, or does that?
I just want to make sure that's something that would be possible for a company to get, because I think if you're adding a regulation that's not possible or not attainable, then it's not going to go anywhere, and it could end up stalling a project approval. So it's not so much that I don't think there's a desire to be good actors. I think it's just, can it be done?
On the state website, it does talk about a limit of 5,000. So I don't think that that's changed at their level. And this bond then would be helpful for not the ones that would be going through a closeout checklist, but the ones who expired or walked away.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm helping y'all achieve consensus, but
And so then the county would be able to,
The beneficiary of the bond.
yeah, okay, that's,
I would be in favor of this.
yeah.
was that a motion, Will?
It sure was.
I'm going to second
Okay.
Will's motion.
Okie doke. So we have a motion by Will, second by Jennifer, for adding a requirement of a $5,000 surety bond to a cannabis permit requirements. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed? Motion carries. Site reclamation So if we keep going down this list, we've got method for calculating canopy, preservation of view sheds, and I'd really like to have Robert here for that one. And then prevention of permitting where previous unpermitted land modifications and violations occurred.
We may be able to tackle that. I mean,
That one was a Holly one, so I'd like to make sure Holly's available to speak to it.
For which one?
The last one,
18.
prevention of permitting where previous unpermitted land modifications and violations occurred. Holly, are you able to speak to that one today, or am I wrong? I thought that one was from your list.
Is the mic on?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. That was on the list. The list that I gave to you was a compilation from a number of people. So I am aware of some of this, but there are other people that would be able to specifically address situations. So probably if it could go to like the upcoming meeting, that would be helpful.
Okay, cool. Thank you. 16. Method for calculating canopy. Let's see, how much time do we have? We have 20 minutes. Can we do it in 20 minutes? Okay. As well as public comment.
state stuff on canopy, right?
Yeah, general public comment for non-agendized or otherwise,
Yes.
yeah. That's
Yeah,
just
well, shouldn't take too long. All right. I'll hand it over to Mary. Method for calculating canopy. I do know that this is something that we have encountered as an issue this last year in particular, where we have found someone cultivating outside of what we thought was the approved canopy area, and they came back and said the state changed the way that they're assessing their canopy area, and so they had to increase, or the state said they weren't even qualifying for their license. So now I'll hand it over to Mary.
So yes, that's correct, what Mireya had mentioned. Staff has gone out on annual inspections just to see the areas in which cannabis is grown being ultimately doubled in some places. And it's due to the state regulations and the state kind of changing how they identify canopy, whether it be just one blanket area, canopy within a cultivation area, or canopy with rows, or canopy with rows and aisles. When we took this item to the board had simply stated they want to see two calculations: canopy within a cultivation area. No other kind of aisles and rows were of interest. They wanted that whole area to be a taxable area for canopy purposes. So with that, we have the state definition of canopy attached to the agenda, and then also the Lake County definition of canopy attached. And this is something that we really want to kind of narrow the scope on and align with the state, but make sure that we're applying it in a way that we can all understand in a generality.
And then there was the communication from the DCC that came in November as well, right, about the state relevant language, and then the sort of referring us to Humboldt County because they have an annual planting disclosure form, and that might be something that Lake might want to look at.
Have we seen that before?
Yeah, I think so. I forwarded it back in, would have been November 13th.
Then I recommend that we you resend that to us. Let's attach it to the agenda, and we'll talk about it with that as a reference at our next meeting.
I will forward that again. Mary, do you want it too?
Yeah, it looks like it should be kind of an easy fix. We want to make sure that we're in lockstep with how the state is doing their measuring.
So I had further discussions with a number of the supervisors on this, because this is something that we had policy on, and then it changed to mirror the state. Therefore, we were only being taxed on our canopy and not our empty walkways. And when I had a conversation after that particular meeting, that recap meeting, and there are some people that are abusing the system and saying and requesting that their canopy is measured by the size of their individual pots. And that is not how the state intends it. It is a discernible planted area, so it is an entire row, not pot by pot, even if there's spacing between those pots. And so I think that if we just stick with the state canopy and recognize that 99% of the actors that are licensed are, doing it as intended, and that it's, a premise that will contain mature plants at any point in time, I think that we should continue with that modification because it has huge tax implications and may greatly affect participation in the program.
If there are no further questions on the task force, let's open it up to public input. I don't see anybody in the room coming up, so are there any hands in Zoom? Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you. Andrew Dobbs Kramer, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. I just want to echo what Task Force Member Smith said here. The policy, as it stands to measure discernible planting blocks, is in alignment with the state. The state does not measure canopy by your entire fenced area. You measure it by your planted area in rows. While the state doesn't give you breaks for gaps in your rows, and I think that's what Task Force Member Smith is suggesting that continue here at the county level is that you be taxed on the actual rows. But walking aisles are not taxable. There's no cultivation happening in walking aisles. You're planting in the hedgerow, and that is your canopy area. So I think that's the way it should be measured and not the entire fenced off area. It's, certainly you don't want to incentivize people to grow into the aisles and then make conditions less safe for workers, make conditions worse for pests, etc. Having appropriate plant spacing is necessary for pest management, employee safety, everything else. And so we shouldn't disincentivize that by trying to tax the entire fenced area.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any other hands raised? Okay, hold on just a second, Christopher. Nara just forwarded us that one highlighted sentence or two, so I'm going to have Mary read that, with the idea of continuing with this item today and not necessarily passing it on unless necessary.
So the email reads, the relevant regulatory sections are 16308, Pren A, Pren 1, and 2. The canopy shall be marked with clearly identifiable boundaries, and the designated boundaries of the canopy area must be of sufficient size to contain the mature plants in their entirety at any point in time. No portion of the plant is permitted to hang over an established canopy boundary.
Thank you. Any further public input? Hands raised?
There was Christopher Thomas.
Christopher Thomas. Please go ahead, Christopher.
Hello. Thank you for letting me speak. My name is Christopher Thomas. I'm really just backing up what the gentleman and Jennifer said. We've been inspected, I guess, 4 times now by the state, and every time they do the measurement, they tell us they go from T-post to T-post on the row and all the way down. And that's my input. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any further hands raised? So bringing it back then to task force, the recommendation that we're looking for is if you want to go from this 8-line, 9-line description of canopy that is current county to the state definition, which is that one sentence.
Or the state code potentially that was quoted.
Yeah, coincide to sync up with state code.
I move that we calculate canopy in alignment with the state's calculation policy.
We have a motion.
Second.
And a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Are there any opposed? Okay, that one passes.
Cross one off.
So we've got 17, which is not today, because I like Robert here. 18, which is not today, because we need other people here. Odor, which we can't do in 10 minutes.
I would say the odor and density of cultivation probably should be the same day, because my guess is that they're substantially similar in terms of the discussion.
Okay, should we start on those next week?
Gonna have to do it sometime.
Yeah, so Holly, go ahead, the people that you were gonna notify, let them know that it's not likely we'll get to that one, 18 next week, because I think odor's gonna take a while. But if you could just give them a heads up that we do need them when we get to that item, that'd be great.
Can I ask a question on, well, I guess this would be public request or comment, but is it possible to get maps of, if we're going to talk about cannabis density and in setbacks, would it be possible to get maps of where, the operations occur, both pending and current?
I think we might have that already in those cumulative impact maps, the ones that we share at the planning commission hearings. Would that suffice? Because that kind of has a size of
probably. I've only seen one of them, I think.
Yeah, it does have like identification. The size of the dot varies according to the size of the permit, and so you'd get sort of a feeling for the size of the permit as well as its location.
That would be great. If you could have maybe a map with an overview and then some of the different areas, that would be wonderful.
Okay, well, we can definitely wait. I didn't hear that last part. Overview of
well, if we could have an overview map showing, just generally, in Lake County and then the specific areas, that would be great.
Yeah, we would have that on GIS, so we could zoom out or zoom in as
Okay,
needed.
that would be wonderful.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that.
Just a quick question. Does that mean that the remaining sub-items that we will need to address are 6, 11, 12, 17, and 18?
Could you say that again, please? Sorry.
Sure. I'm just been crossing things off as we've been going, so it seems to me that we have still discussion of the odor concerns on item number 6.
Mm-hmm.
Item number 11 still has some to be discussed, or no?
Yes.
Item number 12 as well?
Yes.
And 17 and 18?
Correct.
Is that everything?
That's what I show.
Okay, just double checking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It seems that the medical program could be a really quick one. Could we perhaps start and finish with that one and have the appropriate code enforcement people here?
Yes.
And then move into one of the longer agenda items?
Sure.
I think we could finish that today.
No, because we
No,
don't
this-
have code folk ready.
Yeah.
But yeah, so at the next meeting, let's start with 12 and then go up to 6 and then 11.
Okay.
Pretty much in that order. I mean, you don't have to change the agenda.
Just take them out
Ruby.
of order.
Yeah,
Okay.
they'll all be on there. Okay, let's move on then. We're not touching 7. Oh, but on number 7, consideration of development standards for cannabis-related businesses. I have been thinking about this one, and I think that we don't have the time in our meetings to go line by line with nothing. So what I have asked is for NARA to assemble what the recommendation of the cannabis industry was, and I'd like to offer that also for any members of the task force. If you have ideas already to recommend for development standards, that would be helpful to add that before we end up with that item. It looks like we're probably a couple weeks out from it. Holly, just reaching out to you also as like a CAP representative, if there are definite recommendations, if you wanted to assemble a table and have it present, then we're not starting from scratch. We'd be starting from different positions and sort of looking to reconcile them.
Maria, can you explain to me exactly what would be covered in development standards?
Yeah, that's fair.
One of
If
the-
you take a
the
look
subject
at
already-
the way the ordinance is currently structured, the development standards are covered at the very beginning in a table, section 1 or 27.13, 27.
Is this table B or,
Yeah, this is in Table B, and it covers the minimum lot size, setback from property lines, off-site residences, setbacks, number of living cannabis plants where appropriate, number of mature cannabis plants where appropriate, minimum fence height, maximum canopy area.
Okay, so Maria, isn't part of that also in number 11?
Are you talking about discussion of density and canopy?
Yeah, if you
Yeah.
look at the
Yeah, it
you know,
sort
the
of does
verbiage that
touch
you
there.
gave us.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we do
What-
have a little overlap.
Okay.
But the things that I just listed are the development standards that we're going to go through.
Okay, so would we include the parts of 11 that include the development standards in just the development standards
I
section?
think that would be
And
appropriate.
there was a request to remove from down to 20 feet or something in lot sizes for 3-1A.
Yes.
I mean 1A and 1B.
Yes, and also keep in mind, it may be appropriate for other business types, cannabis-related business types. One of the attachments in today's agenda packet is the staff report from the board. So it shows the recommendations previously that the board was amenable to on different cannabis-related business types. So please consult that section as well and add in any development standard recommendations you might have for those as well.
That's
Page
item 7.
19.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's page 19. It just has that table that I think would be really helpful for folks kind of thinking about development standards, because this is what we needed to do development standards for.
Okay.
So not just cultivation.
Yes, and I read that, I misunderstood that as setbacks only, and so looking at the rest of the table.
Well, if you keep going through this, most of the stuff we've already gone through.
Mhm.
General requirements, application, all that stuff. So what we're looking at is this table of development standards, is my understanding. If the task force wants to change that or has a different understanding, feel free to let me know. Holly, is that something that you might be interested in doing? Because ideally, we'll have it as part of the agenda packet, so people have time to review all input on that.
We can do that. So just so I'm clear, I'm just going to take that specific table that's currently in the ordinance, and we will look at those specific things. It's nothing other than that.
That is my understanding, and I think I saw nods at the task force. Yeah, so that's what we're looking at as far as the columns go. But as far as the lines go, you'll note that what it currently exists is only for cannabis cultivation licenses. And so then I would ask you to refer to page 19 of today's agenda packet for that table that starts on that page 2 of that staff report, because there are additional cannabis-related businesses that if you just include those, if you have development standard recommendations for those, that'd be helpful. Then we're looking at the whole enchilada.
And that's the table that you have on the cannabis webpage, correct? It has all the permit types and the
Not, if you
Not the
mean
permit
Article
types,
27, no. I mean the staff report that has all the new business types that have not yet been added to the ordinance.
Okay, I got it. I've
Okay.
got it. I'm
Okay,
adding
good.
that down. I do want to point out one thing, though. A number of times it's mentioned that the board feels this way or the board feels that way, and I do want to point out that there are 2 new board members, so that may or may not be true.
Okay, thank you. We just have a few minutes left. Let's go on to public comments. If there are any comments from the public on items that are under the purview of the Cannabis Ordinance Task Force but are not already on the agenda, please approach the microphone or raise your hand. Seeing none. Okie doke. We will go ahead and adjourn this meeting. Thanks, everybody, for coming. This was a good
Thank you.
time. Yeah.